Welcome to a Tech Moment on Cannabis Tech. I'm your host, Christina Etter. In this podcast, we take just a few minutes to talk about some of the exciting science and technology that's shaping and changing and impacting the cannabis and hemp industries. But sometimes we get so buried in the trenches of what's going on here in the United States that we forget there's a whole great big world out there right now that is struggling with cannabis too, and they're making the same changes and they're discovering the potentials and they're going through a lot of the same things that we are. So in today's show, we're actually going to take a little trip around the world, and I've invited Lambert, who is the Vice President of Marketing at GreenBroz, onto the show today. Now, he has spent time with the Denver Post working with the Cannabist. These are some pretty big names, at least from my background. The Cannabist was one of those pioneers in the industry, and he was in charge of media with Weedmaps. We all know that name. Then he went on to GreenFlower Media to expand and strengthen their position worldwide in cannabis education as well. But today, Lance is deeply ingrained in the cannabis industry all around the world and even writes for a foreign affairs column for MG Magazine. So, Lance, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have this conversation today.
Yeah, thank you. Likewise. It's a pleasure being here. Thank you for the invite.
Absolutely. Now, I feel like we do here in the cannabis industry because it has been such a struggle for so long in the United States, for industry really to kind of get a foothold and for the stigmas and things to start to kind of release, that we have a tendency to forget about what's going on in other countries as well. And I think, recently with all the headlines and things that are happening in the news, we have we want to kind of look outside our own borders and kind of see what's going on in other countries and kind of give that touch base on cannabis and hemp and what's going on around the world. But before we dive into, specifics in these different countries, talk to us a little bit about you, Lance. Tell me a little bit about your background. Where's your passion come from for the cannabis industry? And how did you how did you fall into this niche of talking about world cannabis?
It's an excellent question. Not to go too far back, but growing up in Northern California, cannabis was always around me. I grew up in the 80s, so I grew up after the Summer of Love, but it's something that was definitely still prevalent in the community in which I lived and always had a bit of that hippie influence around me growing up. So I always had a level of respect for the plant and wasn't so much intimidated by the war on drugs, no matter if by Nixon or Reagan in the DARE program. So it's something that was always around me. And I do have a bit of a background in, I think now the term they're using is the traditional market or the heritage market. So I, again, am a bit familiar with it before even legalization came about. My passion personally was being a cancer survivor. It'll be 20 years next year that I've been cancer-free. And while my doctors at the time weren't necessarily pro-cannabis, going through that did help me understand that there's more to life than Western medicine. I really started looking at, and this is a big part of growing up again in the Bay Area, because there's a high level of Asian populace, specifically in San Francisco, where I'm coming from. And so, again, always had the knowledge around Eastern medicine, but really learned to appreciate Eastern medicine and look at Mother Nature for solutions. And just like many other things, ginkgo biloba or echinacea or even turmeric and ginger, cannabis is one of those things that in traditional medicine has been looked at as being able to help with many ailments naturally versus going by way of something that's produced out of a petri dish. So that's really where my personal passion came from. It was interesting getting into the legal industry. To your point, I came in by way of media. I was in mainstream digital media and then segued into niche media with the cannabis and then Weedmaps and GreenFlower and so on. The international attention, I don't know, like some people, and you know this, a lot of the individuals you speak to, they have a very narrow focus on what's going on in their backyard. And that might be at a local level, at a city or municipality level, all the way up to county, state, and maybe federal. But I find a lot of the individuals that are focused on this space, at least from the States, that's exactly what they're looking at. They're looking at what's going on in my backyard. How does it impact me? And I understand that. If you're trying to build a brand, especially on the plant touching side, that makes sense. But I felt like there really wasn't enough focus on what's happening globally. It really is a global movement that's occurring right now. And when I tell people that 44 countries have medical cannabis programs and 14 countries and 2 territories have adult use programs, they're just like their jaw drops. They're just not. They're like, no, wait, isn't it just Canada and Uruguay and part of the U.S.? And I'm like, oh no, there's there's so much more going on out there, and that's what ended up with me working with MG on doing a monthly column, as you mentioned, and covering some of these countries. And I really choose the countries that I feel are on the forefront, not just of erasing any existing stigma or tabooism that's been put on them by Western civilization, but also their appreciation and acknowledgement to move forward with legalization. And that's been the path. And I've learned a lot along the way. I mean, it's so much of my time is spent on learning about the history of each of these countries and then the things that opened up the opportunities for them to move forward with legalization. And it all impacts everyone, in my opinion. You know, the earth is a lot smaller than it used to be, even when we were kids. So it all makes a difference to be educated at that level as well.
Most definitely, and I find it so interesting what you said there about there's this misconception that it's just Canada and it's just the United States. And from what I've learned in my time here in the cannabis space is that the United States is actually very much behind the curve. I mean, there are many other countries out there that are far ahead of us in terms of research and in terms of understanding this herb better than we have. And so the United States really has kind of been hesitant or more what's the word I'm looking for? I guess just not really ready to open those doors yet. Whereas in other countries, I think that there's a lot more research going on. I think there's a lot more openness to those kinds of things, like you talked about the Eastern medicines and Ayurvedic medications. These kinds of different approaches to healthcare, I think, kind of open people's minds to cannabis a little bit more. And for that reason, I just really feel like there's a lot of other countries that are much more open to cannabis from this perspective than we are here in the United States. Would you say that that's what you're seeing as well?
That is spot on. I try to explain to people a similar, unfortunately, but similar to the education system here in the U.S. While we might think that we're leaders, especially in the first world nations, we fall back every year, and it's the same with cannabis. As legalization continues to evolve, and to your point, even more so, the education in the study around medical and scientific aspects of the plant, we're way behind. And unfortunately, the studies ever since Nixon's war on drugs, which started in 71, that halted a majority of the legal studies, both in respect to cannabis and the psilocybin solutions as well from a medical standpoint. Now, not to say there haven't been studies that haven't occurred over the last 40, 50 years in this country, but more so in the private sector and in the private school systems as well. But we're so far behind a place like Israel, which Israel is definitely the global leader, both in scientific and medical. They're not necessarily the best at understanding how to actually grow the plant and process the plant. That's one thing that I see they're a little handicapped. But really understanding the dynamics of the plant, I was totally taken aback. And having gone out there, it was 2018 when I went out for a trade show, an industry event out there, getting to hear the head of, they have a college that studies cannabis and cancer, and hearing what they're doing as far as the studies. And at that time, it was simply in petri dishes. They hadn't segued to human trials yet. They were finding cultivar specifics, combinations of cannabinoids that would counter and eradicate cancerous cells. And it wasn't an ambiguous. It wasn't like Rick Simpson oil will, RSO will help you because you have a back issue, or RSO will help with it. It was very specific, and they took breast cancer, prostate cancer, colon cancer. So three of the top cancer killing problems in the world, again, not just country specific. And we're able to show up on the screen how they're able to eradicate a majority of these cells, these cancerous cells. Again, being a survivor, that kind of hit home. And you asked where my passion comes from, and that's really it. And I love other friends in the industry that put more of a focal point on building their brand or their reputation. That's never been a thing for me. And I've had people say, well, why don't you take more of like the Ed Rosenthal or we miss him, Frenchie Cannoli, that approach where it's more about me. It's not about me. It's about educating the average consumer and individuals that are mainstream and trying to erase the stigma and tabooism and rise up the whole community. Because it takes a multitude of us. It takes educators like yourself and having a show like this, and educators like myself that have a column, to be able to help people understand that it's not that bad. It's not an egg in a frying pan that's going to scramble your brain, and it doesn't induce laziness or forgetfulness. Quite contrary, some of the studies are finding with Alzheimer's and PTSD, some of these things that they're discovering really unlocks a lot of elements that otherwise would not be solved, would only be, sorted with band-aids, if you will, from Western medicine solutions.
Exactly. Exactly. And you're speaking to my heart here, because that's cancer in my family was running rampant. It's one of the reasons why I came to Colorado in the first place. The doctors in the Midwest were absolutely killing my husband with opiates because of chronic pain. So I saw those negative impacts of this Western medicine. There's a pill for everything solution. And when my family members, my mother, my father, and my sister, all three passed from cancer, and I watched this cocktail of drugs that they gave all three of them there towards the end of life, and I thought, there has to be a better way. There has to be a better way to treat this. My sister was hallucinating from morphine and trying to kill spiders that weren't there, and there was all of these things that were happening that it just felt counterproductive to me for taking care of them and making them comfortable at the end of life. I just felt like there was something else, and that really was a big part of what drew me here to Colorado to try to understand this plant better. And it's these stories, it's listening to your story and hearing what other countries are doing and all of these advances that are happening, and then knowing the anecdotal stories. And I think that's why all of us are so passionate about saying, look, there's something here. Sure, maybe we have to prove it. Maybe we need more scientific evidence. Maybe we need, more of the data to put behind it. But we have to admit that there's something there, and these are alternatives for people.
I agree wholeheartedly. And when people understand and learn about things like the endocannabinoid system, and understanding that all mammals except insects have this system, and so there is a solve. And it's funny you mentioned Colorado, because that's where I learned so much. And like you mentioned with the Cannabist, and my former colleague and the founder of the Cannabist, Ricardo Baca, we actually had an award-winning article on families that had migrated to Colorado to help find solutions for their children, most often with grand mal or epileptic seizures. And we did an article where there's a young lady that was having up to 95 seizures a week, and with the right combination of cannabinoids was able to bring that down to 5 seizures. I was done. I was like, that's it. This is where I belong. This is where I'm going to stay. And it's interesting when I left there, because I had friends from the mainstream, Scripps and in some of these larger companies I'd worked with, that said, oh, are you going to come back to mainstream? Are you going to come back to what you've done? It's not too late. Like I had taken the wrong path by pursuing cannabis, or this category, right? And first off, I told them I wouldn't work for a company that would hold this against me, because if they're that naive or that closed-minded to not understand the potential of something natural as a solution, I wouldn't want to work for them anyway. But I said, second, this is something that's bigger than us. To your point, I mean, this really does have, and I'm not saying it's a miracle for everything, but it is a miracle for a lot of things. And I was actually at a CBD, it's a monthly group. This was in the early years, post legalization of adult use in Colorado. And there was a scientist that's up in front of the room, and he said, and this will hit home for you, he said, we took it upon ourselves, myself and a few associates, to try to find a supplement in the natural space to a pill that was costing cancer patients $50 per dose. And this is all too familiar, right? Because some of the medicine, just like they did for my dad, $20,000 a month in beta tests that wasn't necessarily approved by the FDA, right? And so he said, we sought out and we found cannabis, and we were able to produce one pill for 28 cents versus $50. And the way that this plant interacts with your body is like no other. And so after it, of course, being a person who's constantly wanting to learn, I had to ask him some additional questions. I said, so you're talking about how cannabis works so much better because of having an endocannabinoid system. So is this kind of like Legos and Legos versus Legos and Lincoln Logs when you're speaking of ibuprofen? He's all, that's exactly it, because our bodies are not designed to uptake something like ibuprofen. He said that's why you can take 800 milligrams a day, because only half of it's going to be absorbed into your body. You're only going to absorb 400 milligrams. Cannabis, you're going to absorb it all. It's going to be used for what it's needed for, and if not, then the rest will flush through. So hearing it from a scientist, and it's one thing to hear from a doctor, but even doctors ultimately are educated by scientists in these instances. So to hear from an individual that understood the plant and plant science at that level, again, that was another, I'm on the right path. I do a lot of trusting into the universe being spiritual, and that's one of those moments where I was like, this is where I belong, and I don't want to go anywhere else. And have enjoyed being more so, leaning towards the educational, even with a company like GreenBroz or formerly with Bovida, where my goal was to head up a unit or to expand a brand or the business. They still allowed me to be able to have this voice from an edge, and they kind of knew, when I sign up, I'm like, this is part of the deal that you get, for me to continue to educate. And thankfully, again, the companies, even the one I'm with now, is very understanding of that. So it's great.
That's phenomenal. And you're right, it does become an absolute passion to educate and to spread the things that we're learning and to talk about all of these things. What's from your experience and studying what's happening all around the world, what's kind of really shaken you, or what's really kind of stood out to you in the global market in terms of cannabis acceptance and cannabis proliferation, I guess?
It's an excellent question. I was just having this conversation. Just literally got back last week from a 10-day tour over to Europe to Holland and then on to Spain for Cannabis, which is one of the largest. Started out as a protestable, but now is really a B2B and protestable event in Barcelona. And I was speaking to a friend who is a bit newer, younger guy who's newer to the industry, and he's asking me what events I like and which ones I've been to. And I'm very fortunate. I've been to places that definitely were not on my bucket list. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It just, I had never imagined going to Tel Aviv in Israel. I'd never imagined going to Berlin for cannabis, let alone South America and the Pan Pacific. One of those instances that I shared with him was there's an event in Prague, which is in the Czech Republic. Beautiful city, one of the few, as the locals are proud to tell you, was not bombed during World War II. And so there's a lot of history there. And they had an event called Cannafest, and it was at the local fairgrounds, if you will, but very nice, established, all proper buildings and meeting spaces. And one thing that caught me off guard, because no matter how long you've been in this space, in this community or industry, again, on either side, either they're regulated or not, I think there's always things that surprise you. And I walked into one of the facilities, one of the buildings there, and there was a makeshift, they had this room, all glass partition room, and it was a daycare center, a makeshift daycare center they had set up for the individuals that were in the industry that were attending this event, but that had children and needed a place for them to be cared for. The first thing I thought, especially being a criminal justice major in college, was that would not fly in the States. You'd have child protective services, right? You'd have CPS that would be knocking on the door going, there is no way you can have these children anywhere near. Now, keep in mind that this is Prague. It wasn't a legal market from an adult use. It's not like there was any sort of trade or any sort of plant product on the floor. It was all ancillary. It was all brands promoting themselves. But of course, the ideology and the stigma that's associated with places like the US, that would have caused a bit of an issue. I was so impressed to see that because it tells me that they don't have the same stigma, being more of that Eastern Bloc than Western Bloc of Europe. They were never exposed to that Western movement that started out again all the way back in the Anslinger days, and what happened in The Hague with 1912, with all this movement of first making one drug illicit and then just putting everything else into that fold. Obviously they weren't exposed to that dialect. But on the inverse, going to Australia, they have, which again, if you're a big fan of the culture and craft, this is one I definitely recommend. It's almost like going to the Emerald Triangle in the US. But there's an event, I was there for the 25th anniversary and then went again for the 26th. And it's actually in a little town called Nimbin, which is about 45 minutes from the Gold Coast in Australia. And they have an event called Mardi Gras, not Mardi Gras, but Mardi Gras. And it was very reminiscent of being back home in NorCal because you had this group of hippies that came out of the 60s and 70s and kind of went more towards that homesteading communal path. And they went to this little beautiful area, just inland, very rural. There's only a few entrances and exits to the town. And they just established their own community. And going there, and again, just seeing how people interacted and how they associate with the plant. But then people that were traveling out of that area after the event, the fact that you had police checkpoints and they were swabbing the interior of people's cheeks to test them for drugs, which, if you followed that study at all, because we've been doing quite a bit of investigating here in the States to see how we can, which I totally support, how we can make sure there's obviously safe driving and operating of heavy machinery if under the influence of anything. But you'll know that they haven't found that solution for being able to properly track when someone is actually inebriated over a certain limit of cannabis. But here the Australians bust out this swab and they're like, well, you have THC in your system. Never mind, it could be from not just hours or days, but it could be from weeks prior, and that's just what it is to them. And I'm like, you got this isn't even how is it? This isn't even proper science for this plant. This doesn't make sense. So I've seen it all, and I wish more communities were on the same page. But again, you just have that inconsistency because of the history with the plant, really. So
Right, right. And it's so, I think it is so frustrating, at least from, the perspective of people like you and I that are deeply ingrained in the industry. We see things from a different perspective. We've, studied the science, we've looked at the technologies, we understand these things a little bit differently. And I can tell you it's so frustrating for me to see that side of it, to see lawmakers and even doctors and people that don't understand things from that perspective. It kind of leaves a scratch in our head saying, no, wait a minute, if I am just a journalist out here in the middle of nowhere who's able to, learn and comprehend and understand these things, why are these people that are paid far more than I am not able to do so as well? So it really kind of becomes very frustrating to continually try to get that word out there and talk about all of these things that we're learning and then continually see it ignored.
exactly true. It's a bit of frustration, and more voices are speaking up, more advocates. I wish more from the medical and scientific community. Yes, we have celebrity endorsement and we have influencer endorsement, but people trust facts and they want to know individuals that have done the studies and have done their homework. And while there's a lot of it out there, to your point, you and I, yes, it's a passion and it is tied to what pays our bills. So we do come from a different disposition than a senator or a congressperson. But it was interesting, even being a member of the board of Attach, the American Trade Association for Cannabis and Hemp, and going and fighting for the Safe Banking Act and the SMART and all the other acts up on the Hill in DC. It was more of an education session with some of these senators than it was anything else. They really were just kind of going off of what they learned in fifth grade or what they learned growing up back then. And it's like so much has changed and so much is readily available. And if, again, you kind of took it a little more serious, like other countries, again, Israel, Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, Malta, I mean, there's Portugal. We could learn so many lessons from Portugal just in how they treat narcotics in general, but also this plant in specific. It would be an eye opener. But again, the US, I find, in, of course, being from here, being born here, but I try to take an objective perspective. And it goes back to what you said. You're spot on. I tell people we are behind. We might be the leader in certain things like technology and innovation. But when it comes to this plant and the ideology around it and how it's been weaponized and how it's targeted specifically minority groups, but really has targeted and harmed the populace at large as well. Um, we need to get out of the 70s. We need to get out of the 80s. We need to recognize that a lot has changed and a lot has learned since then that we should adopt. So we have a ways to go, though. That's for sure.
Definitely. Definitely. Absolutely. So, where's the next big cannabis boom outside of the United States? Where can we expect to see cannabis get the next stronghold?
Interesting question. So, there's while there has been a lot going on in South America, which there's not as many people who are attentive to LATAM in general, so Latin America, but was stoked to see Costa Rica just pass their medical bill a few weeks ago, thanks to a new president in office. There's been a lot going on down there, several of the countries. have already come on board. But the biggest movement and the loudest noise is coming out of Europe. It really is. And it's specifically Western and Northern Europe. So we had a couple of things that happened. So we knew that Luxembourg was talking about moving towards adult use. They have been um, for almost 4 years now, to be honest, and they're finally instituting it. But it's a little similar to what we saw here in Washington, D.C., where you had it being more so on the private side versus the commercial or capitalized side of things. So while Luxembourg is relevant, it's going to be a slow burn there. But then all of a sudden, and this was crazy because I actually had a friend that was out from the Cannabis Association in Germany to be on my podcast back in December. And this news broke 2 days before I came into the studio here in Southern California. They actually announced adult use legalization in Germany. That's a big deal because for those that aren't tracking the global politics, Brexit did occur. That was discussed for years, but the UK has officially pulled out of the EU. So the EU is now 27 countries. Germany has really stepped up, especially during COVID. They had a PM that was really on top of being that assertive voice in the COVID space. And so they are being looked at more so as a leader than ever before in the European Union. And so for Germany to announce, okay, not only do we have a medical program, but we are going to advance with adult use, that was a big one. And then on top of that, just a few weeks later, I want to say it was December 17th that they announced it, that Malta, while Malta is not a large country, Malta has always been a very relevant country in Europe. It's about 50 miles offshore from Sicily, Italy, so it's down there. Population of 519,000, so it's not the largest country. But again, for them to move forward with an adult use program, that was something that was big news. So it was kind of this 1-2 punch last December coming out of Europe. And then already you have France and also Ireland that I think they were waiting for the US to move forward, at least with a medical program, because we do have a lot of influence on the international stage, right? So Europe, in several of its respective countries, especially that we have good relations with, were waiting for us and they got impatient. And France and Ireland are good examples because both of them are actually in beta medical programs right now. And I especially have to applaud the French because they recruited one LP, a Canadian LP, one LP to volunteer all the medicine to this test, and then all of the patients to volunteer. So it's nothing to do with capitalism or profitability. It's purely we want to study and see if this plant really makes the difference and impact that we've heard of, and then move forward from there. But Europe is just it's moving, it's advancing by leaps and bounds, especially out of Switzerland. CBD, they've seen a drop in nicotine cigarette consumption by 21% since introducing CBD cigarettes in places like your local Aldi and stores and such. So we know that it's making a difference just from a health standpoint beyond some of the ailments that we spoke of that cannabis makes an impact on as well. So I keep an eye on Europe in general.
Interesting. So very interesting. And I also find it interesting that that's one of the big markets there. I feel like that's a growing market here is those people that are looking to move away from the nicotine, move away from tobaccos. I know that I personally have had a lot of people reach out to me wanting to end their nicotine addiction and they're looking for CBD to do it. So that's phenomenal to hear that that's one of the areas that's really moving forward in Europe and that we're seeing that change. Should American businesses, should American cannabis companies be considering this global market, or is it really too soon for that yet? Do we need to wait for federal legalization before we even, start thinking about things across the pond that direction? Or is this something that, do you feel that cannabis businesses really need to take seriously now?
I would think, again, we can divide it, and oftentimes we do, whether you be plant touching or not. So if you're an ancillary company, then by all means, if you plan on being that industry leader, or that category leader specifically within your segment, then I very much would recommend looking at it from a global scale. I was fortunate to be a part of that with Weedmaps, planting flags in Australia and Spain and Germany. And this was back in 2015, 2016, before much of the world was even thinking about these other places. But even more recently, again, with Bovida, that's one thing they're focusing domestically. And I'm like, I think we need to work this from the outside in versus the inside out when it comes to building the brand, because things are going to move quicker than we think. And so I would recommend that if you're on the ancillary side. If you're on the plant touching side, it is a little challenging, but it can be done. Obviously, it's very similar to the MSO structure here domestically, where you do need to collaborate with someone who is a local, license holder or local permitted operator, producer, processor. So that's something to take into account. So the logistics might be a little bit more entangled if you are trying to expand a brand, but Burner is a good example. Cookies has a cookies shop in Tel Aviv. I went into their cookies lounge in Amsterdam. I stopped by their cookies social club in Barcelona. A friend of mine's operating. So it can be done with that right brand that has the right people in the right mindset to make that move. But it's not easy. I mean, it's difficult to expand a brand in general. Look at the history of companies like Nike, Coca-Cola, and Apple, just as large examples, and you see the time it took for them to conquest and become that household name in other countries and other regions of the world. Now add on top of that something that is tied to what was considered illicit or went through prohibition in many of these markets as well. And it brings a dynamic to where you want to make sure you have the right point of contacts and the right network in those local markets. And that's, again, where I've been fortunate and why it was so important for me to go to Barcelona, as much as friends and family were like, should you go to Europe right now with everything going on? And it's like, okay, well, first off, that's a couple thousand kilometers to the east. So, but it is important because that's the one place I could go where I could catch up with my network from every region around the, I mean, from Peru to Australia to Canada to Germany. I mean, there's people from all around the globe that attended that event that I need to keep in contact with to know what's going on and stay abreast of the movement again at that level. So.
Right. Now, since you've been to so many different places and you've experienced so many different cultures, I feel like we also need to kind of touch base on the non-business aspect of going into business in other countries, because just like you talk about, there's definitely those legal issues, there's the stigma issues, but there's also culture issues. Can you talk a little bit to what it's like in the various countries in terms of working with these different cultures and dealing with business in such a unique industry in these different countries?
So that was another conversation that happened last week, just talking about, in my opinion, there's certain things that transcend all cultures, all languages, some things that you really don't need words in order to have that level of commonality with other individuals. And it's three things really that I found. It's food, it's music, and it's cannabis. Those three things, no matter where I go, it's a very universal way of, I understand this beat. It makes me want to move. I need to eat. This is the food that you provide. And then obviously cannabis, again, is this connectivity. The association with the plant, it varies so much. You have elders in Thailand that have been growing cannabis next to their mushrooms and their ginseng in their backyards for well over the last several centuries. But then again, you go to the other extreme where you can be arrested and prosecuted and even capital punishment if you're in a place like Singapore or in Saudi Arabia. So you do need to be cognizant of it. But the cultures are important because if you do go to, we'll call out South Africa really quick. So South Africa, cannabis has been looked at as a drug that's associated with the lower class. So almost the way that people look at individuals that use PCP or methamphetamines here in the States. It's that low of the low on people that they can't go any further down, and it's really just getting that dopamine fix. They'll do anything to get it, beg, borrow, steal. That's the ideology towards cannabis in South Africa. So that's a whole different stigma that you have to come across and help people understand. No, this is natural. In many parts of the world, this is holistic. In many parts of the world, it's religion. If you go to India, this is a part of their religion, right? So they have Bang as an association to their religion. But recognizing what that is and understanding that the way it's consumed, not just why it's consumed, definitely varies from market to market and from country to country. And once you understand that, again, it will help you be able to craft the right way to approach that market if you feel you have something that they could benefit from. But again, it takes time and a lot of homework. I mean, there's a few hundred countries that you have to be doing your homework on to understand where you want to move your business. So.
Right. So tell us a little bit about GreenBroz. Are you currently working on or working in an international market with GreenBroz? And just give us a little bit of background on your company in general.
Yeah, definitely. So GreenBroz, we're celebrating our 10-year anniversary this year. Was actually founded in Southern California, got its start up in the Triangle. That was where the first machine was sold and actually engineered, researched and developed with local resources up in the Triangle. A few years ago, the company did move to Las Vegas just to get to a larger operation, as well as tax benefits, not only for the company, but for the individual. No state income tax and the rest of it. California has become a bit of a challenge to do business in and to live in because this is technically where I'm based out of. The company itself, we are expanding. So while the company has had representation on the international level, it hasn't had the level of focus and concentration that was needed. So that was a big part of a trip I had to Costa Rica back in January to support the legalization and to meet with the government down there actually and talk about how GreenBroz can help them establish their SOPs and protocols towards properly processing medical cannabis. The same with the conversations that were had in Europe last week. Yeah, it's something different because as much as you know the name, it's Kichi, Green Bros, and we do the OZ for the ounce as a nod to the history and everything. But kidding aside, when you look at the offerings within our category of this industry, we're the only ones that really take it serious as being automation solution for the medical patient and the medical side of the industry. Now, not that it can't be applied to adult use, but just as a quick reference, all of our machines utilize 316 stainless steel. That's not food grade. That's surgical medical grade. When you're on the table, or when I was on the table, getting cancer cut out of me, that's literally what I was laying on. That's the level of safety that we believe in and that should be required. And while the U.S. is not notoriously known for GMP standards, unlike our neighbors to the north in Canada, it's very much a requisite in a lot of these countries, especially in the medical countries. So Germany being one of the strictest when it comes to SOPs and GMP rules and regulations associated with it. So everything we have, again, 316 stainless steel, washed down ready, so it can be fully cleaned and sterilized. So those are the things that we're trying to communicate as we expand the industry's solution that we offer into these global markets. So it's definitely a big priority for us, especially this year.
Right. Well, and I really feel like as this industry continues to evolve and as we start to learn more about how cannabis is grown and how these products are produced, I feel like that's something that has to be looked at. I mean, we know from past experiences in food production, in supplement production, in medicines production. I mean, we can go back to the 80s and talk about the tainted bottles of Tylenol that made onto the shelves, so many years ago. There are regulations and standards for a reason. And until cannabis was legalized and until regulation was put out there, we really didn't know what we were getting. Now you factor in, modern times, modern chemicals and modern chemistry practices and all of these different things that we have now that didn't exist, say, in 1968 when people were smoking, and I hear that argument all the time from people. Well, people have smoked for hundreds of years without any issues. Well, yeah, they weren't making Roundup like they were 100 years ago either. So, I mean, it's these things, I think, that now we have to look at these regulations and understand that they're there for a reason. And I feel so lucky to be a part of this industry right now as we are literally on the cusp of making these changes and making the cannabis industry, I think anything that we consume as a human, we want it to be safe. I think that's just, kind of common sense, right?
Yes. I agree, more so than ever. I have to admit, I kind of teased the way of the hippie. It wasn't cool by the time I was growing up, right? It was the evolution of the yuppie when I was growing up in Northern California. So all of a sudden, the hippie became kind of, yeah. And all of a sudden, I've become an adult, and obviously, some of the things that I've lived through, I'm like, wow, they were onto something. Going back to the earth, and the earth does have the answers and the solutions. Mother Nature does have the right offerings, and that again goes into the Eastern medicine ideology, but I find myself going, oh my God. I mean, I'm drinking apple cider vinegar here and kombucha and, all of a sudden hummus and 10 grain chips. It's crazy. But you're spot on when people talk about, well, they've been consuming it for centuries, no matter if it, again, being tied to religion in the Middle East or being tied to Eastern medicine in Asia. But it was something that was being consumed, but totally different. I mean, while the genetics might have been there, what we call the genotype, right? So the genetics, but the phenotype, what that outside exposure is and was, is two very different things. Because you mentioned Monsanto, and one of the articles I did for MG was on Colombia, which is a phenomenal place. Great latitude and altitude for growing. But what a lot of people don't know is during the war on drugs, matter of fact, as recently as 2001, we're still funding money to try to eradicate not just cannabis production, but even more so almost poppy production for opium down there. And believe it or not, they were spraying Asian orange. Well, what is Asian orange? Asian orange is Roundup. That's exactly what it is. So I have friends down there like, Lance, I've got 100 hectares of land. Half of it's tainted because of your government. I'm like, you're making this up. Then I did some digging. Then I found some studies by a couple of very accredited colleges where individuals did studies on what happened down there. And I'm like, my gosh, these guys are right. And we can't be consuming those things because this plant is part of the phytoremediation class, right? That's why they're cleaning up the isotopes in Chernobyl with hemp plants right now because it pulls up all the heavy metals and all the pesticides and herbicides from the land. So to find virgin land to be able to produce what our parents were smoking back in the 60s is becoming a challenge, especially in countries like the US where I hate to say it, but we have extreme capitalism where money talks, where people don't really put that focus on, I want it to be natural, I want it to be healthy, and I'm not just going to assume because it's green that it is all natural and healthy. And I was on a call with a friend, very smart grower up in Humboldt, southern Humboldt, and he's talking about the challenges because he's like that. He has what we call a closed loop grow operation. So he has the sheep that create the manure, which comes in, the worm carcasses come out of that, which comes into his. So everything's all cyclical, and he doesn't use any pesticides or herbicides, only natural things like neem oil and other things from the earth. And here, his product is any medical patient I would trust his product with. And he's having these individuals, these middlemen that are saying, I'll give you $200, $250 a pound. And he's like, it cost me $350 a pound to produce this. Well, we can get it from these guys for 200. And he's like, but those guys are using poison and slave labor. Literally, this is still happening in California. I know this is like a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, is this? Yes, it still happens, especially when you have, gangs or mobs associated with production. It still happens. And to your point, the end user isn't the wiser. They're like, well, it smells like OG Kush, it must be, or it smells like Skittles, it must be Skittles. You know, that's why we get to test it, and that's why it matters.
And I'm so glad that you brought up the concept of extreme capitalism because I really feel like that's what it is. In this world that we have created, where there is an ability or a way to cut a corner and save a dollar, 9 times out of 10, the company, the business is going to do that just because it's right for the bottom line, and that's all that they're concerned about. And now I feel like the cannabis industry, and I just had this conversation last week with another person, but I feel like the cannabis and hemp industries now have this opportunity, and it's a once in a lifetime opportunity to say, no, we're going to do things right this time. And rather than looking at it from that extreme capitalist position of anything goes as long as we're making money, let's do it right. Let's put good, safe, healthy products out there for people and make sure that we're doing things the right way, because we don't want to be in another 20 years looked at like the nicotine industry or the tobacco industry that did things wrong for so long. And I think we only have a short window of opportunity here to make those changes.
I agree. I agree. Now is, I mean, a lot of people say, oh, we've just scratched the surface. We're in infancy stage. We have so long to go before federal. But I actually beg to differ. I agree with you. We're laying the foundation. A lot of people are like, well, that's just the foundation. That you're building a 20-story skyscraper. The foundation is the most important element of any structure. That's why it takes so long to build. That's why people drive down the road. It just happened to me. I was like, those guys were working there for like a year, and all of a sudden there's a hotel because so much effort and energy went into the foundation to be able to put those walls up. So that's exactly what we're doing right now. So while people think we're still early on in legalization, this is when everything is sorted out, because what we do today does affect tomorrow. And again, I have to applaud places like Colorado. Although Hickenlooper and Hancock were not big fans of the adult use legalization movement, at least they allowed the infrastructure to be able to have the education around it, to have campaigns which we help promote at the Cannabis. Start low, go slow, and purchase legal so you know what's in your bud. I mean, these are things that the consumer needs to understand. And it's weird because a lot of consumers understand it with tangible goods, but they don't understand it with cannabis. They understand if they're going to buy something that costs half as much, cheap costs you double, because you're probably going to have to buy that same thing in a year versus buying something you can depend on for 5 years. So it's the same with cannabis. It's no different. If you want quality cannabis that is made correctly and doesn't use poisons or doesn't use fillers, then you are going to pay a little bit more. That's why Tito's cost, I don't know, I don't drink alcohol anymore, $25 a bottle versus Pop Off that costs $10 a bottle, right? I mean, it's just the end consumer needs to apply that same ideology to this. And for some reason, they don't. So, I applaud states like California and Colorado are like, this way you know what's in your bud. There's something called COAs, and we do look to see if there's heavy metals or if there's pesticides or herbicides in your weed, because surprise, you're not supposed to inhale that. Just like when you vape, you're not supposed to inhale heavy metals. Great campaign they're doing there as well against the nicotine organizations. But it's funny because everything we talk about, it all comes back to the education. Like, just get educated as a consumer. That's step one. So
100%. So what's on the horizon? What do you think the cannabis industry has to look forward to, whether that's domestic or globally? Where are we headed in the next 10 to 20 years, do you think?
my gosh. So I think something's going to happen. For the last 3 or 4 years, I've been saying that 2022 will be a watershed moment at some level or another domestically, and I still think that's applicable. I still think we're going to have a surprise left field around midterm elections. That some kind of conversation to take serious, at minimum, decriminalizing. Hopefully descheduling, but at least decriminalizing, because there's enough people speaking up. I love how the minority groups have stepped into the conversation as well and pointing out the fact that the plant has been weaponized domestically for a century. And it's so wrong. But I think once we get past that and move towards the potential and understanding where this can go, the sky's the limit. And I really do wish, and this is being a little more personal, being a NorCal kid at heart, I do hope it happens sooner than later, because the opportunity for the small growers in this state specifically, being we are the epicenter for craft and culture, in many instances genetics as well, the global stage is waiting for us to legalize. And we know that the opportunity exists for exportation, because look at Canada. I mean, look, I was talking to a friend from England last week, and two LPs supply all the medical flower to England. Now, that's kind of surprising to me because GW Pharmaceuticals, who's the largest exporter of medical cannabis, is based in England. So I don't know why they're not. I digress. But the point being is, Canada has already been playing the game of life without the US really being involved for the last 4 years, right? They have grow operations in Colombia that supply the European market. They've had grow operations in Portugal and in Australia for the last several years. Like, they're laying out this foundation, and they're doing exceptionally well. And while Canada is the second largest country, I mean, come on, you guys, it's 35 million population. There's more people in the state of California. Look at how much they're rewarding that community by being more proactive in supporting the movement. And yes, it's for financial gain. It's a government, they're for profit, but that's the opportunity for us. Now imagine a place like the US where we've got that reputation for craft and culture. There isn't a place I've been to, and I've been on 5 or 6 out of 7 continents thanks to this plant, where there hasn't been someone that's been like, "Oh, you're from Humboldt? You're from up in Northern California? That's where Humboldt is, and Mendocino." Like, we have these appellations that the entire world knows about. And if we could legally send product, because it's illegally getting to those places, but if we could legally brand and build a Coca-Cola of cannabis coming out of Humboldt, that would be beneficial not just to that community or to the state, but to the US being recognized as a leader on that global stage when it comes to cannabis. Right now, we're really handicapping ourselves, and I may be a little critical here, but I think it really is at the fault of blue hairs that should have retired years ago in DC. They're still living on to those Nixon ideologies. And my gosh, you guys, stop washing your clothes down on the river. There's a washing machine in your room for a reason. Just use it. Get with the times. Get a little more modern here. So it's crazy, but I think that's where we'll get in the next 10 years. I hope.
No kidding. Right, right. And you're right. I mean, eventually these things are going to change. We know that there's new ideologies. There's new blood that is moving into the lawmaking space, So I feel like we can't help but be optimistic and continue to have hope that things are going to change. I know we keep saying year over year over year that it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, and it just never seems to get here. But we know that it is. And eventually, cannabis is going to be legal across the nation, and markets are going to start to open up. So it really is just kind of a banner moment, I think, to be a part of this industry and see all of these changes and to see how things really are just evolving all around the world. Earlier you mentioned Thailand, and that was one of the places that just really kind of blew my mind with how they really embrace the herb. And it's fascinating to have you here on the show and have you talk about all of these different places and things that you've experienced. So we really appreciate that. It's fascinating to have this conversation. Tell us about how our listeners can get in touch with GreenBroz and learn more about the company and maybe even get in touch with you.
Yeah, definitely. So GreenBroz Inc. You can find us at greenbroz.com. We're on all social media handles under GreenBroz or GreenBroz Inc. So quick search, you'll find us. This company does love, covering things from an educational perspective. So a lot of the information you'll find out there, whether it be on our webinars or some of our collateral, we do talk about education around the proper way to process the plant, because that's our focus first and foremost, is making sure that we maintain the quality, the consistency, and have that in the entire throughput process of this plant post-harvest. So that's the way you get in touch with the company. Myself, you can find me online. 805 Lance is my IG handle, or Lance Lambert on LinkedIn. I'm an open book. I have random people reach out to me all the time. I'm so happy to say I've had people I've been able to help out take that leap into the industry and into this community. One thing I will say to individuals that they tell me they're passionate, but they're like, I don't know enough about the plant, or I don't know. I said, I don't know what you think this industry is, but we need more people than any other industry. We need everything from HR to sales to marketing to scientists to doctors to logistics. I had a guy who had, some pretty level status with the government, and he's getting ready to retire. And he's like, Lance, I don't know. I'm like, well, once you change your status and once you get retired, you got to pursue it, man. I'm like, logistics like nobody else. You've been doing logistics for the government for the last 20 years. What better person than you to move into this space? And he did. He wrote up a post on LinkedIn about it, the influence. And I'm like, I love those stories because there's so much opportunity in the space for everyone. If you're passionate, that's all you need, is to have your passion. You can bring your other expertise from any other community, any other industry. So any way that we can help, and GreenBroz supports that and supports the community wholeheartedly. So definitely appreciate. Thank you for having me on. It's been awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm just going to echo what you said. People, don't reinvent the wheel. The cannabis industry needs whatever skills that you can bring, and there's so many opportunities here. So if you are interested, start doing your digging now, because there's definitely going to be a lot of opportunity in the future, and as this industry continues to grow. So definitely get your feet in there. Lance, thanks so much again for coming on the show today and talking to us about all your adventures and all your expertise all around the world. We'll definitely want to have you back again and have another conversation, because this has been a lot of fun.